On a crisp December evening, the hustle and bustle of London Paddington Station moved with its usual urgency. Among the travelers boarding the 4:50 p.m. train to Brackhampton was a woman of no particular note, Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, a stout, practical widow in her 60s. She was on her way to visit a dear friend for Christmas. The train was busy, filled with commuters anxious to reach their destinations. Mrs. McGillicuddy nestled into her third-class compartment, grateful for a moment of peace. As the train rattled along the tracks, the world outside was a blur of snow-dusted trees and passing villages. It was during this otherwise uneventful journey that something extraordinary happened, something that would haunt Mrs. McGillicuddy's thoughts and change lives forever. Her train began to slow slightly, drawing parallel with another train heading in the same direction. The two trains ran side by side for a brief but unforgettable moment. Looking out the window across the narrow gap, Mrs. McGillicuddy saw into the carriage of the adjacent train, and what she saw was horrifying. A man stood with his back to her, his hands tightly gripping the throat of a woman in a fur coat. The woman's eyes were wide with terror, her hands flailing helplessly before going limp. It was unmistakable. She had just witnessed a murder. In shock, Mrs. McGillicuddy sprang to her feet, crying out in alarm. But by the time anyone responded, the other train had pulled ahead and disappeared into the night. No one else had seen what she had. The incident was dismissed. After all, how reliable was the testimony of an elderly woman traveling alone? But Mrs. McGillicuddy knew what she had seen. When she arrived at her destination, the quiet countryside estate of her dear friend Miss Jane Marple, she told her everything, every horrifying detail. Miss Marple listened carefully. She didn't dismiss her friend's account. In fact, she believed her completely. And just like that, the wheels of a new investigation began to turn. There was no body, no suspect, no reported crime, only a single eyewitness and her unshakable conviction. But for Miss Marple, that was enough. She had cracked mysteries with far less to go on. It was time to uncover a murder that no one believed had happened. Yet, when Mrs. McGillicuddy finished recounting the horrific scene she had witnessed from her train compartment, Miss Marple didn't blink an eye. She believed her friend completely. Not out of sentiment, but because Elspeth McGillicuddy was not a woman prone to hysterics. She was sensible, observant, and certain of what she saw. But therein lay the dilemma. Despite going to police, no one took the claim seriously. No body had been found, no woman reported missing, and there was no confirmation that any crime had taken place. Without evidence, the authorities could do nothing. For them, it was a dead end. For Miss Marple, it was just the beginning. Miss Marple had a different way of approaching mysteries. Where others relied on formal evidence and procedure, she relied on intuition, logic, and a sharp understanding of human nature. She knew that if a murder had been committed, there had to be a body, and if there was a body, someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. The question was, where? She considered the route. The murder must have taken place between Paddington and Brackhampton, somewhere along the line where the two trains had run side by side. She studied maps and schedules, looking for places where someone could dispose of a body without attracting attention. It would have had to be somewhere isolated, somewhere with access to private land, somewhere the average commuter wouldn't notice. That's when a name stood out, Rutherford Hall. A grand old country estate not far from Brackhampton, Rutherford Hall had its own private grounds and a stretch of railway running directly behind the property. The hall was home to the Crackenthorpe family, an eccentric and increasingly dysfunctional clan headed by the miserly Luther Crackenthorpe. To investigate without alarming the family or raising suspicion, Miss Marple needed an inside presence, someone smart, discreet, and trusted. She knew just the person, Lucy Islesborough. Lucy wasn't your average domestic help. A well-educated and intelligent young woman, Lucy had turned her skills to professional housekeeping and had built a stellar reputation. Miss Marple offered her a temporary post at Rutherford Hall with one key objective: to search the estate from top to bottom and find the missing body. Lucy agreed. With calm precision, she applied for a position at Rutherford Hall. The Crackenthorpes, desperate for competent help, hired her almost immediately. And just like that, Miss Marple's plan was in motion. No one at the Hall knew, that a murder investigation had arrived at their doorstep. But the halls of Rutherford held secrets, and someone was desperate to keep them buried. Lucy Islesborough was no ordinary woman. She was young, clever, and perfectly poised, with a sharp mind hidden behind a calm and pleasant demeanor. Over the years, she had carved a niche for herself among England's upper crust as the housekeeper who could manage the most chaotic of households. Her decision to accept Miss Marple's mission was not just professional, it was personal. There was something thrilling about it, something dangerous. When she arrived at Rutherford Hall, Lucy took in the scene with her usual composed curiosity. The estate was grand but crumbling, its atmosphere thick with age, secrets, and unspoken tension. The Crackenthorpe family, as she would quickly learn, were not an easy lot to deal with. First, there was a patriarch, Luther Crackenthorpe, a bitter, domineering old man who rarely left his room and seemed to enjoy stirring conflict among his heirs. Then there were his adult children, the suspicious and sharp-tongued Emma, the sullen Alfred, always vague about his work, Cedric, the bohemian artist, Harold, the proper and uptight banker, and Brian Eastley, a former RAF pilot with a young son, Alexander. Each member of the family had returned to Rutherford Hall for the holidays, making the house a boiling pot of conflicting personalities and long-held grudges. Lucy fit in seamlessly, quietly observing the dynamics while carrying out her true task, locating the body. Miss Marple had suggested that the corpse might have been hidden in the grounds of the estate, perhaps in one of the outbuildings or storage spaces. That made Lucy's job easier. As housekeeper, she had full access and could move about without suspicion. Her search was meticulous. She explored the cellar, examined the stables, poked around the unused sheds, and quietly listened to the servants' gossip. Days passed with no sign of anything unusual, until she turned her attention to the old, rarely used sarcophagus in a disused barn. It was a strange object, almost theatrical in its ancient Egyptian design. Once meant to be a novelty piece, it had long since fallen into neglect. Lucy approached it cautiously, her instincts tingling. With effort, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside was the body of a woman, well-dressed, carefully placed, and unmistakably dead. The murder Mrs. McGillicuddy had witnessed was no figment of imagination. The body had been found, and with it, the game had changed. Now the police would have to listen. Now the world would have to take notice. And someone at Rutherford Hall, someone smiling, laughing, pretending all was normal, was a killer. The discovery of the body in the sarcophagus sent a quiet shockwave through Rutherford Hall. Lucy Islesborough wasted no time. After carefully replacing the lid and locking the barn, she made a discreet phone call to Miss Marple, who immediately contacted the local police. Detective Inspector Craddock, a competent and curious investigator, was brought in to take over the case. He had worked with Miss Marple before and respected her keen mind, even if she wasn't officially part of the force. The body was examined. It was that of a woman in her early 30s, stylishly dressed, with no identification. Strangled, just as Mrs. McGillicuddy had described. There were no immediate clues as to who she was. She wasn't local. No one from the nearby towns or villages had reported anyone missing matching her description. The press, thankfully, hadn't caught wind of the discovery yet. Inspector Craddock preferred it that way. The less noise, the easier it would be to trace the truth. But without a name for the victim, the investigation stalled almost immediately. Miss Marple, however, had another idea. She believed the woman had been lured to the estate, or possibly killed elsewhere and then hidden on the property. But the question remained, who was she, and what was her connection to the Crackenthorpes? Soon after, an unexpected clue emerged. Among the woman's possessions, subtly hidden in the hem of her coat, was a small scrap of paper with a name, Anna Stravinska, a European-sounding name. Foreign, possibly Eastern European. It was a thin lead, but it was something. Miss Marple and Craddock began their inquiries, trying to trace the name. That's when another detail began to fall into place. A few weeks earlier, Luther Crackenthorpe had received a visit from a woman claiming to be the former dancer and companion of his deceased son Edmund. Her name? Anna. She had said she was in England for a short time and simply wished to pay her respects. Was this the same woman? Had she returned? Suddenly, the quiet country estate became a hotbed of suspicion. If the dead woman was indeed Anna Stravinska, then her death was personal, very personal. Someone at Rutherford Hall had known her. Someone had greeted her, and someone had murdered her. One by one, the Crackenthorpes were questioned. Their answers were civil, careful, controlled. Too controlled. There was something lurking beneath the surface of this aristocratic family. Resentment, secrets, and perhaps motive. Miss Marple knew that when dealing with a family like this, history and hatred often ran deep, and someone was hiding more than they let on. With the body confirmed and suspicion rising, Rutherford Hall began to feel less like a home and more like a stage set for something sinister. Inspector Craddock continued his inquiries with calm demeanor, but his eyes missed nothing. And beside him, quietly gathering observations like a spider in the corner of a room, was Miss Marple, listening, watching, stitching the truth together thread by thread. The Crackenthorpes, outwardly cooperative, each presented a calm front, but underneath, tension simmered. Emma Crackenthorpe, the daughter who stayed behind to care for her father, remained guarded and polite. Her loyalty to the family was unwavering. But there was weariness in her voice, as if years of managing her difficult father had worn her thin. She claimed to know nothing of the mysterious Anna or her visit. Still, her hesitancy to speak too openly made Miss Marple raise a silent eyebrow. Then there was Alfred, the second son, shifty, always looking over his shoulder. He had vague business dealings and often needed money. More than once, he'd been suspected of shady ventures. When questioned, Alfred was defensive. His eyes darted too quickly. His story was too rehearsed. Cedric, the third brother, had arrived from his artist commune in Ibiza. Blunt, bearded, and eccentric, he seemed more interested in scoffing at the investigation than contributing. But his distance didn't exclude him. Sometimes the ones furthest from the scene had the most to hide. Harold, the banker, was polite to the point of stiffness. The kind of man who valued order, reputation, and appearances. He denied any knowledge of Anna, too, but his demeanor was a little too polished, like someone who'd rehearsed for this very moment. And Brian Eastley, the widowed pilot and father of young Alexander, had a more affable air. He was the only one who seemed genuinely unsettled by the events. Still, Craddock and Miss Marple had learned long ago that even charm could be a mask. Then there was Luther Crackenthorpe himself, sharp-tongued and miserly. He remained holed up in his bedroom, barking orders and insults with equal ease. He had no kind words for his children and spoke of them with suspicion and contempt. In fact, the old man seemed convinced one of them was after his money or his life. Money, inheritance, motive. Miss Marple took note. Each of the Crackenthorpe children stood to inherit a substantial sum upon their father's death, and while Luther remained alive, he controlled everything. If the mysterious Anna had been perceived as a threat to that inheritance, well, that changed things. The family was playing a quiet, deadly game. Miss Marple knew it. Craddock sensed it. But the killer, the one among them with the darkest secret, was still out there, hiding in plain sight. As Christmas neared, the chilling unease inside Rutherford Hall deepened. Snow lay thick on the grounds, lending the estate a picturesque beauty that sharply contrasted with the growing dread within its walls. Miss Marple remained a quiet but steady presence. She understood something the police often overlooked, that the truth wasn't always found in loud declarations or obvious lies, but in small gestures, strange silences, and subtle shifts in tone. And within this family, with its tangled emotions and bitter resentments, every word held weight. Inspector Craddock continued his interviews, digging deeper into the family's past, pressing for details about Anna Stravinska. Slowly, a picture began to form. Edmund Crackenthorpe, the deceased son whose memory still lingered, had died in the war. But before his death, he had reportedly become involved with a woman abroad, someone the family disapproved of. Could Anna have been that woman? Had she come back to claim something she believed was hers? Or had someone feared what her return might reveal? There was no will, no legal claim, but inheritance wasn't always about paperwork. Sometimes, just the suggestion of a claim was enough to provoke fear and violence. Then Just as the investigation seemed to stall again, something happened. Alfred Crackenthorpe was found dead. At first glance, it appeared to be natural causes, sudden, painless, almost convenient. But the doctor wasn't satisfied. Tests revealed traces of digitalis, a deadly poison, in his system. This wasn't coincidence. Miss Marple, calm as ever, sat knitting quietly in the drawing room, her mind racing. The killer had struck again. And this time, they'd silenced someone who may have known too much. Alfred's death shifted the investigation from mystery to manhunt. Now, the police were dealing with a double homicide, and the family, once resistant, even mocking, had grown visibly shaken. But not everyone. Miss Marple noted how certain members handled the news. Emma's tears seemed genuine. Harold's face turned pale in the snow outside. Cedric paced, muttering about family curses with theatrical flair. Yet it was Brian Easley's reaction that stood out. His concern was for his son, Alexander. And that was telling, because sometimes guilt isn't worn by the guilty. It's reflected in the ones they seek to protect. The killer was growing desperate. Their secret, once buried, like the body in the sarcophagus, was now cracking under pressure. And with each passing day, the danger grew not just for the family, but for Lucy, for Inspector Craddock, and for Miss Marple. As the investigation intensified, an unlikely pair began to play a subtle but surprisingly effective role in unraveling the mystery. Alexander Easley, the young son of Brian, and his visiting friend, James Stoddart West. The two boys, full of curiosity and unburdened by adult caution, had taken it upon themselves to explore every nook and cranny of Rutherford Hall. What began as child's play quickly turned into an informal investigation of their own. They crept through unused rooms, peeked behind curtains, and whispered theories in secret corners of a sprawling estate. And then they found something. Hidden behind a loose panel in one of the old stables, James spotted a torn scrap of fabric, deep purple velvet, distinctly out of place. Alongside it, a gold-clasped earring, delicate and expensive-looking. The boys, sensing the importance of their discovery, took it straight to Lucy Islesborough. Lucy, always composed, recognized the significance immediately. The earring matched the style Anna Stravinska might have worn, sophisticated, foreign, and unique. The fabric, too, seemed to match the outfit the dead woman had been wearing when found. Someone had tried to dispose of evidence, and they'd failed. Thanks to two curious children, Inspector Craddock took the find seriously. The stable had already been searched, but not thoroughly. Now, it was clear the killer had hidden traces of the victim there before relocating her body to the sarcophagus. But why there? And more importantly, who had access? The stables were used rarely these days. Only a few people on the property had keys, and among them were members of the family. Miss Marple sat with the boys later that evening, pretending to be interested in their storybook. But as they proudly recounted their adventure, she listened with careful attention. She knew that children, often overlooked, saw what adults missed, and she now had something she hadn't before, a connection between Anna and a specific location. It was a thread, and Miss Marple was an expert at pulling threads until the whole web unraveled. Meanwhile, the killer remained at large, watching, waiting, and no doubt wondering just how much Miss Marple had truly guessed. Just when it seemed the storm was beginning to settle, the killer struck again, this time not with stealth, but with audacity. It happened during a seemingly innocent family meal. Emma Crackenthorpe, ever the dutiful daughter, had helped prepare steak and kidney pie for supper. Everyone was present. Harold, Cedric, Brian, young Alexander, and even Miss Marple, who had been invited to stay at the hall under the guise of needing rest after catching a cold. The meal was pleasant. As pleasant as any meal could be with an air of suspicion thickening the room. But shortly after dessert, Harold Crackenthorpe began to cough. Then he turned pale. His hand trembled as he reached for his water. Within minutes, he collapsed. Panic erupted. Craddock was summoned at once. The pie was tested. Poisoned. Again. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the far end of the table, lowered her napkin with a calm precision. She'd taken only one bite. It was clear now. Someone in that room was trying to eliminate witnesses. First Anna, then Alfred, and now Harold. Each death drawing the noose tighter around the killer's own neck. Each murder growing more desperate, more reckless. But this attempt had failed. Harold had survived. Barely. He was rushed to the hospital, unconscious but alive. It was a bold move by the killer, but also a mistake. Poisoning someone at a shared family table had narrowed the list of suspects significantly. The meal had been prepared under Emma's supervision, but the ingredients had been left unattended in the kitchen earlier that afternoon. Only a few people had the opportunity to tamper with it. Miss Marple, as always, considered the psychology behind the act. This wasn't the work of a cold, calculating stranger. No, this was personal, messy, emotional. The killer was no longer just eliminating threats. They were reacting, lashing out, and that meant they were feeling the pressure. But pressure makes cracks. And Miss Marple was watching them all. Every glance, every silence, every twitch of guilt. The killer was slipping, and soon they would fall. 3 deaths, or near deaths. 1 killer. And now, the noose was tightening. Miss Marple knew that facts alone wouldn't crack this case. What she needed was a reaction, an unguarded moment, a slip of the mask. So, she proposed a bold idea to Inspector Craddock. Set a trap. The plan was simple. Use Lucy as bait. Lucy Islesborough had already proven herself capable, intelligent, and brave. She'd earned the family's trust and the killer's. Now, Miss Marple asked her to use that trust, to act as though she had stumbled upon new evidence. Something small, a vague clue, a hint that she might know more about Anna's identity than she truly did. It was a dangerous gambit. Lucy agreed. At breakfast the next morning, Lucy casually mentioned she had found a button in the stables, one that looked like it had come from Anna's dress. She said aloud, almost as if thinking to herself, while pouring tea and buttering toast. Every eye in the room shifted. Some showed mild interest. 1 pair froze. Later that day, as planned, Lucy pretended to take a walk through the garden and into the stable. She lingered by the hidden panel. She bent down to examine the imaginary button, and behind her, footsteps, soft, measured, calculated. She turned and saw him, Dr. Campere, the quiet, unassuming family doctor. He smiled gently, even as his hand reached into his coat. Miss Islesborough, he said smoothly, I'm afraid you're in danger. But Lucy was ready. Before he could act, Inspector Craddock stepped out from the shadows, revolver drawn. Miss Marple followed close behind. Dr. Campere's expression didn't change. He knew it was over. The final piece had fallen into place. With Dr. Campere in custody, the tangled mystery unraveled at last. In the drawing room of Rutherford Hall, Inspector Craddock laid it all out, but it was Miss Marple, quiet, precise, relentless, who delivered the final blow. The truth was almost too twisted to believe. Dr. Campere had fallen in love with Emma Crackenthorpe, but with the family's inheritance divided among the sons, Emma would never be free of their grip or their entitlement. And then fate delivered an opportunity straight into his hands. He had known the murdered woman, Anna Stravinska, long before she ever stepped into Rutherford Hall. She wasn't just a random victim or a stranger on a train. She was his estranged wife, legally married, never divorced. That meant if she came forward, he would be exposed, not just as a liar, but as a bigamist. His marriage to Emma would be impossible, and his future would be ruined. So he followed her. That fateful day, on the 4.50 train from Paddington, he'd boarded quietly, stalking her down the corridor. He strangled her in cold blood. He didn't expect anyone to witness it. But Mrs. McGillicuddy had seen everything. The panic began. He needed time. Time to hide the body, remove any connection to himself, and silence any threats. When Lucy Islesborough discovered the corpse in the sarcophagus, it accelerated his plans. He poisoned Alfred, someone he believed might have suspected something. Then Harold, to keep the others from looking too closely. But it was his reaction to Lucy's planted clue that finally gave him away. He had been careful, but not careful enough. Miss Marple turned to Emma, her voice soft. He murdered to be with you, my dear, but a man who kills for love will kill again. Emma nodded tearfully. Her face was pale, but there was strength behind the sadness. She had suspected something, perhaps not murder, but a darkness she hadn't dared name. As the police took Dr. Campere away, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Her work was done. The case that began with a scream on a passing train was over, and once again, justice had arrived, quiet, precise, and wearing a tweed hat. Watch the full episode now and discover how Miss Marple uncovers a murder on the 4.50 from Paddington train. Like if you love classic mysteries, and subscribe for more gripping crime stories. Comment below, who do you think committed the murder before Miss Marple solved it?